recorded. If you do have any questions, please type them in the chat box and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can at the end, time permitting, of course. Otherwise, please do leave your contact details and one of our team members will get back to you after the session. We also have several poll questions during this webinar and we would love your participation so we can share the results and discuss them live. At the end of the webinar, we'll also share a QR code with you and we'd be grateful if you could scan that QR code at the end and complete the feedback form. Your feedback is important to us, so we would be grateful if you could take a moment at the end to please fill in the feedback form. Now, before we begin, we do have a legal disclaimer. The information we are sharing today is current and accurate as of today's date. However, it is of course subject to change in the future without any notice. The information we are sharing today is of a general nature only and does not constitute migration law advice. As such, it should not be relied upon, and we strongly recommend that you seek case-specific advice from the server immigration team. Also, any discussion of processing times is approximate only and can vary. Now, joining me today are my colleagues, Janae Scalacci, who is a service delivery manager in our Australian immigration team and also an Australian registered migration agent. We also have 3 account managers with us today, Arabelle Chow, Girly Velasquez and Calvin Chin. They work very closely with our clients in the APAC region and also work closely with our operations teams. So they'll be able to share some valuable insights with you today. In terms of today's agenda, the locations we will be covering are Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, China and Malaysia, which are all server immigration direct delivery locations. Now, just a brief overview of Server for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We are a global leader in moving, relocation and immigration services. Our global footprint, cutting edge technology and in-house capabilities, which does include immigration services, means we can offer you an integrated moving and relocation solution. Now onto the poll questions that I mentioned a moment ago. We'd love your input and to hear about your experiences since we have such a wide audience today. We have 4 poll questions in total. So the poll questions will appear on the screen and you'll have the opportunity to submit your answer. We will then be able to share the results with you live and discuss. So first poll question, how has your organisation generally managed international assignments during this ongoing global pandemic? So potential answers include new international assignments have been put on hold or cancelled, reduced or limited to critical roles only, or proceeding as per usual to the extent possible. So if you can please submit your answers. Okay, we will close the poll question in 3, 2, and 1. All right, so in terms of the final results for this question, we've got new international assignments have been put on hold. So 10% of respondents answered to that question. The overwhelming majority have said reduced and limited to critical roles only. So 56% of you answered that. And then we have 34% proceeding as per usual to the extent possible, which is great to hear. Moving on to question 2. Which location has presented the greatest mobility challenges? So options are Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, or Malaysia. So please submit your answers. And we'll close the poll in 3, 2, and 1. All right, so majority of you at 47% answered Australia. Then the second country was China at 26%. We had 0 respond answer Hong Kong. So we'll go through some of the challenges posed in Australia a bit later on. So Janaea will talk about that. So we'll be able to unravel what some of those challenges are. Moving on to question 3. What's been the greatest mobility challenge in 2021? So options for answers include borders remaining closed / securing entry approvals, costs, desire of assignees to go on assignment, immigration processing, availability of flights, or rapidly changing situations and circumstances. So if you could please submit your answers. And we'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1. So the overwhelming answer was borders remaining closed / securing entry approvals, and that may be also why Australia was picked as the country where you face the greatest mobility challenges. So 44% of you said borders remaining closed, and then that was followed by immigration processing with 24% of the votes. All right, moving on to our final poll question. Question 4, so this is a yes or no question. Has your organisation considered developing a policy on employee vaccination? Yes or no? So please submit your answers. I can see the polls going back and forth. We will close the poll question in 3, 2, 1. All right, so 58% of you, the majority, have said no, you haven't considered a vaccination policy, and 42% of you have said yes, you have considered it. So this is something in the last few weeks, especially, that we're seeing more and more in the media, with more companies, particularly those in the US and quite a few in Australia as well, announcing that vaccinations will be mandatory for returning employees. Thank you so much for participating in that. Now, on the next slide, we have a regional snapshot which provides you with the latest high-level updates on entry requirements. In the interest of time, I won't go through this in full detail, but you will receive a copy of the slides and the presentation today. So if you can review this in your own time if you wish. So now we'll move into our country-specific discussions, starting with Malaysia. Now, from a regional perspective, we've been able to compare immigration systems and their efficacy throughout the pandemic. For example, Australia's immigration system is largely online with minimal manual input required. As such, whilst we have seen an increase in processing times for some visa classes, the submission and processing of visa applications has largely been unaffected throughout COVID. Now, this is quite different to the immigration process in Malaysia, which has both an online and a manual component. And going back to March 2020, Malaysia first implemented a movement control order, otherwise known as MCO. And since then, we've seen multiple extensions or variations to the MCO, including this year. Now, as a result of the MCO, processing times by the immigration authorities were certainly impacted, and at times we saw very restricted services being offered by the authorities, subject to daily quotas on how many people could walk in through the doors, and even a cessation of services at one point when no applications were even being processed. So for those of you who are familiar with the Malaysian immigration process, you'd be aware that there are 2 main steps in the process. Firstly, an online application, and then once the application is approved, submitting the passport for endorsement over the counter. As of today, the authorities are accepting applications and processing applications that were submitted online. And prior to COVID, we saw processing times about 5 to 7 working days for online applications, which is fairly quick compared to a lot of other locations. This has now extended to approximately 3 to 4 weeks from the date of lodgement of the online application. However, in regards to arranging endorsement of the pass, an appointment must first be made with the authorities. Walk-ins are strictly not allowed as part of the SOPs for COVID. Now, given the limited number of appointments on any one day and potential backlogs from previous office closures, the current wait time for an endorsement appointment is approximately 3 to 4 months. So there's quite a significant lead time there. And what's very important to note from a compliance perspective is that before an assignee can commence work in Malaysia or be paid in Malaysia, their pass must be endorsed in the passport. So if there's one key takeaway that you take away for Malaysia, it's that the pass must be endorsed in the passport before an assignee can commence work or be paid in Malaysia. Now, it's also not possible to book an endorsement appointment well in advance before the assignee arrives in Malaysia. So a key challenge being faced at the moment in Malaysia is what to do with assignees during that time, from when they've arrived in Malaysia to when their pass is endorsed. Arabelle, do you have some client experiences that you could share with us in managing this initial period?
Yeah, sure, Maria. So as you mentioned, the endorsement process is actually taking a longer time. Clients do have to be mindful of the immigration delays, and employee cannot work until the endorsement is processed officially. As such, client must carefully plan for the immigration time that's required and the possible time of when an employee can start work in Malaysia. We're encouraging our client to actually start planning way ahead. Client may want to do a check with the authorities if they have any special support from the government, especially if they're working for essential government projects. We understand that some companies have special grants that's negotiated through government's liaison team, so employees can actually start work immediately and have endorsement of their passport expedited. So considering that the employee may not be able to start work 3 to 4 months upon arrival, employers should consider the employee's living costs, like the accommodation, as well as relocation setup costs. Employer may want to provide an allowance in support of the employee's time in Malaysia during this time that they're not able to work, but clients should consult with their tax provider on when is a good time to make payment, because it may result in taxes. From the duty of care perspective, the employer should ensure that their employee has the proper insurance coverage during this time, even if they are not able to start work.
Thanks, Arabelle. And depending on the seniority of the role or the particular project the assignee is working on and its benefits to Malaysia, Server has been successful in requesting expedited endorsement appointments from the authorities on an ad hoc basis. However, it's very important to note that such requests cannot be guaranteed and should only be used very sparingly for genuinely senior or critical roles. So for example, one of the roles that we were able to secure an expedited endorsement appointment for was for a new CEO coming into Malaysia. So in those situations, we've worked closely with our clients to prepare a strong justification letter and supporting evidence to highlight the commercial reasons why the assignee is required to commence work urgently. But as I mentioned, these requests would only be granted in very limited circumstances. So in the majority of cases, it would likely be that 3 to 4 month wait before the pass can be endorsed. In terms of lead times for Malaysia, so at the moment, we'd recommend that you factor in approximately 4 to 6 months for the end-to-end process to be completed for a new application. And factors that weigh into that include potential delays in assignees procuring documents, particularly if their passport needs to be renewed, advertising the position for immigration purposes if needed. So that's a form of labour market testing that was introduced earlier this year, processing delays from the authorities, then obtaining an entry approval if outside Malaysia, then of course the difficulty in trying to secure a flight and making sure that flight isn't then cancelled, and then of course the wait time for an endorsement appointment. So all up, we'd recommend about 4 to 6 months when it comes to planning your new assignments into Malaysia. In positive news, however, we are seeing the authorities take active steps to try and reduce their workload and catch up on backlogs, which will ultimately see processing times improve. So in the past, assignees have often had to apply for what's called a special pass. So that would be required in the situation where if you have a new assignee who's coming into Malaysia and their entry visa expires before the pass is endorsed, or for existing pass holders in Malaysia, their current pass expires before the new pass is endorsed. As I mentioned, in the past, they would need to apply for a special pass to regulate their immigration status. So this represents a separate application that needs to be submitted to the authorities and then processed, which of course increases their workload. But in positive news, it was recently announced that for new or renewal applications for PVPs, employment passes, and residence pass talent and their associated passes such as dependent passes, where they've been approved but an appointment cannot be secured before the expiry date, the endorsement may proceed without the need to apply for a special pass, which is great news. So that measure is in effect until the 31st of December this year. And we certainly welcome this measure and hope that it will allow the authorities to gain further processing efficiencies and start to see those processing times and wait times for an appointment reduce. Now, moving on to Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is another location where we see a largely manual immigration process. We need to physically submit a paper application over the counter and then have visa labels placed in the passport as well. Due to COVID, the Hong Kong Immigration Department has at times over the last 18 months been completely closed or only providing urgent services to the public, and that did impact processing times. However, in good news, they've resumed full operations since February this year, and all visa applications are now being accepted for processing. In terms of processing renewals, the Hong Kong Immigration Department did implement 2 new measures during COVID. Firstly, prior to COVID, the window for being able to submit a renewal application was 3 months in advance of the expiry date. So that allowed sufficient time for the renewal to be processed. However, during COVID, the Immigration Department reduced this window to only 1 month prior to the expiry date. So if visa processing times are about 4 to 6 weeks from the date of lodgement, there are instances where a renewal application may potentially not be finalised by the Immigration Department before a current visa expires. Now, what's important to note is where this happens, the assignee will actually need to cease work until the renewal has been approved to ensure full immigration compliance. So unlike other countries like Australia, where an applicant is issued a bridging visa to bridge the gap between the visa expiry and the new visa being finalised, there's no such equivalent in Hong Kong. Now, the second measure that was introduced in regards to visa renewals is more positive. So in the past, applicants had to be physically present in Hong Kong, both at the time of application and collection of the relevant visa labels. However, of course, due to COVID, not all visa holders have been able to return to Hong Kong to submit a visa renewal before the expiry date. So for those whose visa is about to expire in the next 4 weeks, or their visa has been expired for less than 12 months, they can actually submit an application together with the required documents and providing a letter stating why they are unable to return to Hong Kong. So if the Hong Kong Immigration Department is satisfied that they continue to meet the eligibility criteria and that their new application is essentially a continuation of their previous residence in Hong Kong, the department may actually issue them with an entry visa to be able to return to Hong Kong. So that entry visa would generally be valid for 6 months from the date of issue. And an important thing to note in regards to this entry visa is that if the assignee cannot return within that 6-month period, no further extension can generally be granted. So if they are unable to return within that 6-month period, a brand new employment visa application having to meet all the full requirements would need to be submitted. Now, in terms of quarantine, Hong Kong implemented a strict policy of 21 days. Recently, we've seen their quarantine measures eased somewhat depending on the assignee's travel history and their vaccination status. For example, travellers from deemed high-risk countries, which currently includes South Africa, the UAE, the UK, and the US, must be fully vaccinated before they can travel to Hong Kong. So if you're not fully vaccinated and you've been in one of those high-risk countries in the last 21 days, you will not be able to travel to Hong Kong. And even then, with the full vaccination, they must still undergo a compulsory quarantine period of 21 days in a designated quarantine hotel. But by comparison, for travellers from medium risk countries who are fully vaccinated, they will only have to undergo quarantine for a period of 14 days in a designated quarantine hotel. So Girly, when Hong Kong had the strict 21-day quarantine policy, and it still does for some travellers, have we seen that act as a deterrent to assignees coming to Hong Kong? And for those assignees who proceeded to enter Hong Kong and had to undergo that 21-day quarantine, what support did companies provide to their assignees? As I can imagine, 21 days in a small hotel room would be quite challenging. Is there any option of selecting the hotel in advance? Girly, over to you. I think we seem to be having some technical difficulties with Girly. We can't hear her. Girly, can you hear us? I think we cannot hear you. I think though, based on previous discussions that we've had, you mentioned that even though we've seen 21-day quarantine in Hong Kong, we're actually starting to see initiations for new assignments to Hong Kong start to increase, especially from the second quarter of this year. So we're starting to see companies gain confidence in Hong Kong, largely based on the way that it's handled the pandemic, because I think we can all agree Hong Kong has largely managed the global pandemic quite well and has had low case numbers for quite a while. Vaccinations also progressing quite well there, and where there are potential clusters of the virus, it's been able to be contained fairly quickly, avoiding it spreading wider than that.
Yeah. Hi, Maria, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry about that. Apologies, everyone. So I will take that on, Maria, because I was reading and observing the poll a while ago, and to answer your first question is that no, the 21 days quarantine is not a hurdle at all. We have seen that in the poll a while ago that Hong Kong, I mean, moving people into Hong Kong is not one of the challenging countries that our HR and global mobility are heading or moving their assignees now. Actually, what we have seen is it's one of the top countries where we have our remobilization active when all of the Southeast Asia countries and our neighboring countries are struggling to open up because of the border restrictions. So the 21 days, extended 21 days is never an issue. What we have actually observed is that there is an increasing trend or confidence from the clients, from HR, companies, stakeholders, and relocating assignees that Hong Kong is the best location that they are wanting to relocate now. Why? Because of the prudence of the Hong Kong government in implementing border restriction, as well as the reliable medical condition, which you might have said a while ago while I was having a technical issue. So as I've shared and observed with my different clients, that vaccination is also progressing well, and potential clusters are, being contained and ring-fenced before they even go widespread. So what is actually more concerning right now is the availability of the quarantine hotels. It's very limited. I mean, we had in the past, we only have 20, and then it increased to 21 and 31 hotels only when Hong Kong government has never closed. So we have assignees coming in, returning Hong Kong residents are coming in, even the students, Hong Kong resident students, they are returning home for vacation, and they are also taking up the quarantine hotels. So to address that limitations of quarantine is that we have employed an interim solution of having multiple parties to book the quarantine hotels, because it's first come, first serve basis. So the three parties that we have employed is, of course, first our Serva destination service providers, or our service apartment providers like Nomad and Dwellworks. But we have added two, and that's the assignee who is booking as well, and checking and booking, as well as the client travel desk. So we also requested clients to send their initiations way in advance, at least 3 months from actual start date, which is practically true like in Malaysia. So it's not a surprise right now that we are seeing clients sending their initiation at least 5 to 6 months ahead of time. So we have also seen quarantine hotel budget being lifted so that we can book the first available quarantine hotel that we could see in the system. And Serva is also engaged, and this is very interesting. It's only a small amount, but we are asked to arrange a welcome basket provision to be sent to quarantine hotels if that is acceptable by the hotel. Some quarantine hotels doesn't want any third party to give any items ahead of the advance, in advance, because of some issues. So the assignee and family will have comfort goods to consume upon arrival. So these are small things, but are very much appreciated by the assignees and their families. And for the benefit of HR and global mobility, this last part is for you, because in terms of tracking the whereabouts of the assignee from sending location to Hong Kong, mandatory welcome call from HR or global mobility is slowly being implemented. So in this call, HR also provide emergency contacts to the assignee to complement the business continuity plan in case of any eventualities that may arise during the quarantine. So back to you, Maria.
Thanks, Girly. So moving on to our next location, being China. Throughout the pandemic, China has maintained quite a strict entry policy and largely continues to do so. For example, for new applications, when applying for an entry visa at the overseas Chinese embassy or consulate, in addition to the documents that are normally required, a special approval letter is also now required as part of the mandatory supporting document. So this is known as a PU letter, and it needs to be obtained from the local Foreign Affairs Office in China. Now, it's important to note this letter will only be issued where the assignee's trip is deemed essential to China. And the PU letters are generally not being issued for family members, so only being issued for the assignee in most cases. For existing visa holders, foreign nationals who hold a valid Chinese residence permit for work, personal, or family reunion purposes are now allowed to enter China without the need to apply for a new entry visa. So previously, even though they held a valid residence permit, they still had to apply for a new entry visa. However, there are still some restrictions, and travellers from certain high-risk countries are still not allowed to enter despite having a valid residence permit. And France was actually on that list until recently, but back on the 2nd of September, French nationals holding a valid residence permit can now travel to China without the need to apply for a new entry visa and PU letter. So, Calvin, can you tell us how these policies are impacting assignments to China?
Hi, Maria. Yeah, hi, indeed. We have found that clients are facing a lot of limitations due to challenges posed by these PU letters. And also, more importantly, given the border closures, a lot of business trips that used to happen so regularly in the past are no longer possible. So they've had to pivot. And some of them are looking at short-term assignments as a means to replace these business travelers. And the intent is for them to actually stay in China and work on back-to-back assignments over a period of, say, 12 months to support the local businesses wherever they are needed. And given the limitations around border closures, this will mean that the ideal assignee profile has also changed, right, from being any nationality to that of actually Chinese nationals who are going to return back to China, right? And this will mean that they are already working with the company, right, at their home location, right, as a permanent resident. For example, they could be a US green card holder returning to China. So this means that they do not need to go through any of these immigration hurdles, right? And they are able to stay on in China without restriction. And this also means that any accompanying family members, right, if any, should also be Chinese nationals. So it's been a real interesting change in the way I've seen clients pivot and adapt with these challenges being posed due to closed borders and lack of ability to obtain these PU letters. So it's also interesting that for these assignees, the short-term assignment benefits are being tweaked to offer them some flexibility. So, for example, instead of mandating that they stay in traditional corporate housing, clients are more likely to look at situations where it may deem reasonable and necessary to secure a long-term lease for a residence and to provide services through furniture rental or house cleaning, housekeeping, that kind of thing, to make it like a service apartment. But this will mean that these residences will be closer to locations like factories or offices, which may not be in some of these metro areas. It's so interesting to note that typically, because these are short-term assignments, there is no home leave or travel benefit given to the employees, given the intent is really for them to deploy at these locations for extended periods on end. Thanks, Maria.
Great, thanks, Calvin. So moving on to our next location, Singapore. Looking back at last year, Singapore was one of the first locations in the region to introduce entry approval applications. And even as of today, all pass holders must obtain entry approval from the Ministry of Manpower before they can enter Singapore. And as COVID-19 cases started to rise again in numerous countries around the world, the MOM announced back in May this year that Singapore would not be accepting new entry applications for work pass holders from higher risk countries with immediate effect. So this impacted those departing from, transiting through, or visiting a higher risk country in the last 21 days before traveling to Singapore. The only exemption that was given was for workers needed for key strategic projects and infrastructure works. And at the time of the announcement, high-risk countries basically referred to most of the world. The only countries that were not considered high-risk countries at that time were Australia, Brunei, mainland China, New Zealand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. However, Australia was subsequently removed from that low-risk category due to the rising number of cases that we've had here in Australia. So what that meant was for pass holders who had obtained an entry approval to enter from those higher risk countries with arrival dates between the 11th of May and 5th of July, they would actually not be allowed to enter, and those existing entry approvals would be made void. So this basically resulted in approved pass holders who had residence in Singapore effectively being locked out for a period of time and assignments being delayed. However, last month on the 10th of August, the MOM announced that work pass holders and their dependents with a travel history to those higher risk countries could start to apply for entry approval, but there was a condition, and that condition was that they must be fully vaccinated before arrival in Singapore. And as of the 6th of August, higher risk countries referred to all countries except Brunei, Hong Kong, mainland China, Macau, New Zealand, and Taiwan. So the vaccination condition for entry doesn't apply to work pass holders and their dependents if they've remained in those lower risk countries within the last 21 days before arriving in Singapore. Now, it's important to note there are some travel bans that are still in place. So all long-term pass holders are not allowed entry into Singapore if they have recent travel history, which does include transit in the last 21 days to India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. And for those coming from Indonesia, whilst there's not a strict travel ban, it has been advised by the MOM that entry approvals from Indonesia will also be limited. So it's only Singapore citizens and permanent residents with travel history to Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka who are allowed entry into Singapore. So work pass holders and their dependents do need to show evidence of their full vaccination status to the airlines before boarding, otherwise they will not be allowed to board their flight to Singapore. And then they do also need to provide that proof upon arrival in Singapore as well. And as Singapore continues to review and adjust its border measures, we're also seeing Singapore allow fully vaccinated travellers from more countries apply to opt out of dedicated SHN facilities and serve their SHN at a suitable accommodation of their choice. So that could include their residential address. So when I say SHN, that stands for stay home notice, which is basically the quarantine period, but they call it SHN in Singapore. So for citizens or permanent residents, they need to apply via the Safe Travel website 3 days prior to their arrival if they want to opt out of quarantine in a hotel. For those who are not citizens or permanent residents, if they are eligible to opt out, because not everyone is, that request will be able to be submitted as part of the entry approval process. And so if a traveller is then approved to be able to opt out of hotel quarantine, they'll need to present that approval upon arrival in Singapore. And it's absolutely critical that they remain in that declared place of accommodation for that full SHN period. And they actually are required to wear an electronic monitoring device throughout that whole period. So Arabelle, where quarantine or SHN, as it's called in Singapore, is required in a dedicated facility, what policies are we seeing from clients in regards to who's responsible for bearing these costs? Is it the employer or the assignee?
Yeah, so we have actually seen a different approach adopted by clients. One of my clients actually supports the full quarantine costs if the employee is required to stay in the dedicated quarantine facility, while the other client actually supports through the existing temporary accommodation benefit. So for example, if let's say the employee has a 60 days of temporary accommodation benefit and is required to complete, say, as 14 days quarantine, the employee will utilize the 14 days from the temporary accommodation benefit and therefore left with 46 days of service accommodation after completing the quarantine. These are the common approach that we've seen. We've also heard employees not covering any quarantine costs cost at all. In those cases, we do encourage setting the expectation with the employee prior to relocation, because the employee will be incurring a sum of money upon arrival if they have to stay in the dedicated quarantine facility.
Thanks, Arabelle. And Calvin, can you share with us some experiences from your clients when the entry approvals were suspended and the approach that some of your clients took in regards to that?
Sure, Maria. Our experience is that back when there was some uncertainty surrounding when Ministry of Manpower entry approvals was ceased, and there was some speculation regarding when it would actually ease, and no one really know what was happening. So some clients, and I will add that they don't work with Server for Immigration, but they have their own direct immigration provider. They actually stopped all employment pass and work pass applications because the fear was that given there is a validity period for issuance after in-principle approval, the inability to secure entry approval will render this whole thing that they will have to go through this entire reapplication process or extension process again, and they thought that it added too much work, so they just ceased everything altogether until they get more information regarding when the entry approvals will ease up.
Thanks, Calvin. So that's an interesting approach, and it's a different one to the approach that we took here at Server. So what we did was we continued to submit pass applications to the MOM as they were still accepting and processing pass applications, rather than waiting for entry approvals to resume. And we took that approach really to minimize any further delays to assignments once entry approvals were being accepted again. And in regards to the in-principle approval letters, the MOM had confirmed that they would be extended. So from our perspective, there was minimal risk there. Now, in regards to the entry approval process, it's important to note that where SHN is required in a dedicated facility, payment for the SHN costs are now required up front as part of the entry approval process. So, Girlie, can you talk to us about that and how clients are managing the SHN payment?
Sure. It's entry approval and SHN, just two simple words, but we all know how painful it is. And this section that I will be sharing is a positive news to majority of this webinar's attendees, because what we have seen is that not only companies extend support to relocating employees and their families, well, it's given, but now we are seeing more and more support is given to HR and global mobility by the organization through outsourcing the entry approval application, SHN coordination and payment, so that HR and mobility teams can fully focus on their core work and looking after the welfare of their relocation population, the people who will be relocating and their families. So at the end of the day, from a assignee's perspective, by doing so, assignee will only be approaching a single team to support them end-to-end, from visa application to entry approval, to SHN payment, reapplication of entry approval, and so on and so forth. So at every given phase of time, assignee, HR, and global mobility will just be looking at the third-party provider. So at the end of this, quarter 2 and quarter 3 of this year, we are seeing more and more increased outsourcing inquiry for this all admin work to be given to a third-party provider. So that's very interesting, because majority of the platform tools that we have seen updates are all focused into the assignee and not knowing the backbone of the relocation, who are the HR and global mobility. So it's a good time that we are seeing the balance of focus to the people working at the back end. So this is a good news for everyone, definitely. Thanks, Maria.
Great, thanks, Girlie. So moving on to our last location, Australia. Janaea, I'll hand it over to you to take us home.
Thanks, Maria. For today's session, I'll provide an update on Australia's international arrival caps and the travel exemption process. If we have time, I'll also discuss some of the alternative work visa options to the temporary skill shortage subclass 482 visa, which have been gaining momentum recently. So looking back, we know that in March last year, Australia closed its international borders and introduced a system that strictly controls who can enter and depart our country to prevent the spread of COVID-19. International travel to or from Australia is currently only available if you have an automatic travel authorisation or you've been granted an individual travel exemption from the Australian Border Force. Australia's current border restrictions will remain in effect until the 17th of September 2021, unless further extended. So in response to the recent outbreaks of COVID-19 in a number of locations across Australia, our National Cabinet met at the start of July and announced there would be a 50% reduction on international arrival caps into Australia for the period commencing 14th of July until the 31st of August. Those restrictions have since been extended to the 17th of December 2021, with arrivals into New South Wales to be further halved to 750 passengers per week until at least October. These changes have been made to suppress the risks posed by the Delta variant, as well as alleviate pressure on quarantine and healthcare facilities. It's also intended that returning Australian citizens will be prioritised during this window, of which there are currently 38,000 still stuck offshore. So in the last couple of months, we've also seen Australia's Border Force tighten their assessment criteria for travel exemptions and closely scrutinise a number of requests. And that particularly applies to temporary visa holders who wish to take a short trip outside of Australia before returning back into the country, and Australian citizens and permanent residents who are ordinarily resident overseas but wish to return to Australia for a short trip. We anticipate that ongoing border restrictions and tightened travel exemption criteria will remain in place until the end of this year, or until Australia's population has been vaccinated to prescribed levels, which is currently set at 80% at the federal level. Notably, AFP has started to request information in the travel exemption request forms on whether an individual has been vaccinated or not, and if so, when, what type, how many doses. And while this is not part of the current assessment criteria, it's likely to be taken into consideration in the future. As we move towards a post-vaccination setting, the Australian government has said that it would review potential home quarantine trials for fully vaccinated travellers, as well as set larger inbound passenger arrival caps for vaccinated travellers. The National Response Plan also looks to extend travel bubbles to suitable candidate countries such as Singapore and the Pacific. Currently, Australia only shares a travel bubble with New Zealand. However, the quarantine-free travel between the two countries was temporarily suspended due to the Delta variant outbreak. So the next point I'd like to cover today is how companies are managing the strict travel exemption process at the moment. Well, Server has assisted hundreds of travellers with inbound and outbound travel exemptions since this requirement was introduced last year. And this includes applications to bring in skilled workers into Australia for long-term and short-term projects, reuniting family members on shore, allowing Australian residents to travel overseas to conduct business, or to visit family members under compassionate grounds. There are currently two types of exemptions that can be granted. They are the inbound travel exemption for temporary visa holders and the outbound travel exemption for Australian citizens and permanent residents. So with regard to inbound travel exemptions, an automatic travel authorisation currently applies to immediate family members of Australian citizens and permanent residents, a New Zealand citizen who is usually resident in Australia and their family members, and a person who's been in New Zealand for 14 days or more before arriving by air into Australia. And that also extends to citizens and non-citizens of New Zealand. Accredited diplomats, airline and maritime crew, as well as certain business and global talent travellers are also exempt. If a temporary visa holder is not exempt automatically from the Australia's current travel restrictions, they'll need to apply for an exemption via the ABS portal with supporting documentation. As of last month, Australia removed India and Papua New Guinea from the list of high-risk countries and withdrew additional restrictions imposed on travel to and from those countries. So individuals from India and Papua New Guinea can now travel to Australia if granted an individual travel exemption under current global settings, which is a much welcome relief for expats from those countries. In the interest of time, I'm not going to cover all 13 inbound travel exemptions other than to say that we are commonly assisting skilled workers with exemptions whose entry into Australia would be of national interest, who have critical skills or who are working in a critical sector in Australia, who are sponsored by an employer to an occupation on the Priority Migration Skilled Occupation List, or PMSOL. The PMSOL itself was introduced in September last year, but has since been expanded to include 44 occupations as set out by the or as advised by the National Skills Commission. This list primarily consists of executive and construction project managers, accountants and auditors, surveyors and spatial scientists, engineers, science professionals, including veterinarian recently, pharmacists, IT and healthcare workers. Social worker, maintenance planner and chef also make the list. So individuals who are nominated to a PMSOL occupation are afforded priority processing of their employer-sponsored visa, as well as receiving a travel exemption. It's important to note that an individual must be granted a travel exemption, hold a valid visa, complete a COVID PCR test and complete a travel declaration before they can travel to Australia. They may also be required to apply for a state border pass or permit before arriving in Australia or transiting through the states and territories. On arrival, travellers are required to complete 14 days hotel quarantine as mandated by the states and at personal cost to the traveller. At Server, we work with a number of clients to determine the best strategy and map out the sorts of documents required to evidence each claim. Some examples of cases we have worked on recently include securing an inbound travel exemption for a customer service manager who is being transferred to Australia to assist in the establishment of a call centre, being the first call centre outside of the US. The company operates in an emerging technology sector, specifically artificial intelligence, which is considered a priority sector for the Australian government. The position of customer service manager was needed to train new centre staff who are all local hires in specialised technology. So evidence of the company's patents and the individual's proprietary knowledge of the company's product was provided in support of that particular case. Another example is where we've helped to secure 4 preemptive inbound travel exemptions for an accomplished veterinarian who is based in Australia and who has multiple business and research interests across Southeast Asia. As a specialised veterinarian practitioner and a training educator in Australia, her work was deemed to be critical, although not the holder of a primary 482 visa. So submissions were made to evidence the applicant's international reputation, offshore business interests, cross-border research collaboration, along with her ongoing critical work in Australia. So just on that point, while temporary visa holders are able to depart Australia at any time, if they wish to return to Australia after a short trip overseas, they will need to apply for that preemptive inbound travel exemption before they depart. And these exemptions will only be granted in very limited circumstances where the applicant meets the requirements for an inbound travel exemption, such as critical skills, and they have a strong, compassionate or compelling reasons to depart Australia, such as attending a funeral of a close family member, visiting a close family member who's critically ill, seeking necessary medical treatment not available in Australia, or for essential business purposes. So in the current climate, if a temporary visa holder departs Australia before being granted a preemptive travel exemption, it's unlikely they'll be permitted to return, unless there's, of course, reasonable explanation for not requesting the permission before they departed Australia. If a reasonable explanation can't be provided, then the travel exemption is likely to be refused. I'll now change direction, just discuss the Australian citizens and permanent residents wanting to depart Australia during the travel ban period. This particular cohort must receive an outbound travel exemption by satisfying one of 7 criteria. The most common claims that we're assisting with at the moment is for essential business purposes, for compassionate grounds, compelling reasons of 3 months or longer, and returning to a country where they're ordinarily resident. When the travel bans were introduced in March 2020, Australians who were ordinarily resident overseas had an automatic travel exemption to depart Australia. However, this changed on the 11th of August this year. Since last month, this cohort needs to apply for an exemption through the ABF's online portal and provide documents which supports their living arrangements overseas. So evidence could include foreign visas or residence permits, accommodation, employment or schooling arrangements that have been set up overseas. Before moving on to the next topic, we have time, I would just like to emphasise that the travel exemption criteria can be very difficult to navigate and evidence for some travellers, particularly if applying on the grounds of compelling and compassionate circumstances, which are granted on a case-by-case basis and are very subjective in nature. While the criteria is in a constant state of flux, we would encourage you to speak with a migration consultant before making requests on behalf of your employees. Now I'm going to switch it up briefly and briefly discuss some alternative options to the current employer-sponsored work visa, specifically subclass 482. As a result of barriers, risk, costs and timeframes of using a subclass 482 visa, employers and skilled workers are seeking out alternative visa options to fill skill shortages. While we are experiencing quick turnaround times for offshore visa applications where the individual has received a travel exemption on critical skills grounds, other applicants, particularly those based in Australia, are experiencing some delays. There is currently a ceiling of 5 to 8 months for processing of a subclass 482 visa, with priority processing given to nominated occupations on the priority migration skilled occupation list, nominations lodged in relation to global talent employer sponsored visas or within the agricultural sector, and nominations lodged for an occupation in a critical sector or in a regional Australia where applicants are nominated to a designated area migration agreement. Applicants who are nominated by approved sponsors with accredited status are no longer considered the highest priority. Therefore, slight delays may be experienced when when previously applications would be turned around in 5 business days. So due to the unpredictability of skilled independent and state nominated visa programs and the desire for migrants to secure a pathway to permanent residency, we have seen an increased public interest in global talent visas, employer-sponsored regional visas, as well as regional labour agreements. The first visa I wish to cover off today is the Global Talent Visa, which is aimed at attracting high calibre migrants with cutting-edge skills in the arts, sports, academia and business, with particular focus on 10 industry sectors under the Global Talent Independent Scheme. According to reports released in April this year, the largest intake of applicants has been from the ag tech industry, along with health, energy, space and advanced manufacturing and digitech sectors. New industry sectors were introduced earlier this year to include circular economy, infrastructure and tourism and education, with the program intake tripling to 15,000 places since the program was launched in November 2019. So the current processing time for global talent visas is currently 3 months from point of lodgement, even when the applicant is based offshore. However, this doesn't include the expression of interest process, which can be longer than 3 months in some cases. In addition to the global talent visa, we are also seeing employers who are operating in a designated regional area request support for an employer-sponsored regional visa or subclass 494, particularly for positions that correspond with occupations on the short-term occupation list where perhaps there is no pathway to permanent residence. Popular locations currently include Perth, Adelaide, Gold Coast, Geelong and Canberra, which are actually metropolitan or major regional centres in Australia. So regional sponsored visas are subject to priority processing, which may be more beneficial than a subclass 482 in some instances. Lastly, we have seen a marked increase in the processing of partner visa applications lodged onshore since the budget announcement was made in May this year, with some applications finalised in as little as 3 months, down from 2 years. So where appropriate, we have assisted skilled workers who are partners of Australian citizens and permanent residents enter Australia on visitors visas and apply for a partner visa onshore. While waiting for an outcome on that application, they can work on a bridging visa that's in effect. So that concludes the Australian immigration updates. I'll now hand over to Arabelle or Maria, who can finalise today's session.
Thank you, Jania. As Jania had mentioned earlier, that there's a 50% reduction on international traveller arriving into Australia, and arrivals into New South Wales has also further halved until October to ease the pressure on quarantine as well as the healthcare facilities. So with the limited number of passengers in each flight, most of the flights are running at very low capacity. Some flights have approached their passengers to reschedule their flights, and airlines has also been cancelling some of the flights. This means that the air tickets are harder to get and at very high cost. As such, we're advising clients to give ample time when planning for relocation. Previously, we could actually book flights within a week. Now, flight tickets has to be booked at least 2 to 4 weeks in advance. It is also recommended that flexible tickets are booked versus restricted to allow rescheduling of flights. Travelers are also encouraged to call airlines 48 hours before the flight to confirm the seats in case there are further changes. It is the airline who will actually decide who gets on the plane if there's further reduction. Air travel costs has also increased tremendously, and the client has to cater for the additional costs on top of the quarantine facilities. So it has indeed been a challenging time, and the restriction is expected to remain until the end of the year. Back to you, Maria.
Thanks, Arabelle. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of our formal presentation. We're right on the hour, but we've received a few questions, so we'll quickly answer those for those of you who are able to stick around for another moment or so. So one of the questions we received was in regards to, can Indian passport holders travel into Malaysia? So at the moment, India is one of the countries where there is a travel ban. So travellers from India cannot currently travel into Malaysia. And what we're actually seeing at the moment is it's not just travellers coming from India, but also Indian passport holders who are in another location that is not currently subject to a travel ban. They are also experiencing difficulties being able to enter Malaysia. So at this stage, there's no update from the authorities on when that ban might be lifted. But of course, as soon as there is any update, we'll let you know by way of our client alerts. Another question that was popular was in regards to enhanced requirements and more scrutiny of foreign workers in certain locations. So yes, that's something we've certainly seen over the last 18 months. So protectionist policies being introduced to protect local workers. And to be honest, that was not unexpected because we did see similar measures introduced back in the GFC many years ago. So for example, Australia enhanced its labour market testing requirements in about October last year, I think it was. Singapore also did the same. So they doubled the period of time that a position needed to be advertised for to make sure that local workers were given sufficient opportunity to apply for those jobs before a foreign worker was considered. And we also saw the minimum salary requirements increase as well. And then, of course, Malaysia earlier this year introduced a new labour market testing requirement as well, where the position needs to be advertised for a period of time and approval needs to be given by the authorities to confirm that a local worker cannot be found to fill the role. So yes, we are seeing more scrutiny of applications, and that's why it's more important than ever to make sure that you are working with an experienced provider like Server who can guide you through those applications. If we didn't get around to answering your question today, we'll be in touch after the presentation to make sure that your question is answered. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you found it informative. On behalf of Server, I'd like to thank you once again and enjoy the rest of your day. On the screen, you will see the QR code that I mentioned at the top of the presentation. So if you have a moment, we would love for you to scan the QR code and share your feedback with us. Thanks and have a good day.